3-year-old child would be home with her mother. However, when a call came in asking to speak to her mother, this child answered the phone and said that wasn't possible because her mommy was asleep and she was also wearing blue lipstick. She had witnessed her murder and was left alone with her body for hours. You are such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my video. I'm Brooke Makenna, and today is about this little girl who really made investigators look further into this death of her mother because at first glance it was deemed natural causes. But this young girl would also grow up to have so many questions for a man that she believed could have prevented her mother's murder. But first, I want to thank our sponsor, Fume. Now, Fume is to break bad habits by removing the bad from that habit. And sometimes the thought of quitting something cold turkey can be so intimidating, even when you're trying to make better choices for yourself. With Fume, it's not a vape, and they take out the vapor completely and they use flavored air instead. So there are no harsh chemicals, just natural flavors. A friend of mine who has struggled with this bad habit could not believe how similar it felt doing it and how delicious it was, yet they weren't putting those harmful ingredients in their body anymore. And a lot of the times, these bad habits can actually stem from anxiety or stress. And so Fume has actually added some movable magnets which helps you to fidget while you are working towards this healthier habit. I think we can all empathize, or even we ourselves struggle with stopping. And so I'm so thrilled to be able to bring this alternative that is so similar. It almost makes stopping or changing your habits to healthier ones so much easier. And so there are actually thousands of success stories with Fume, and the next one could be you. And so I really hope that this helps someone out there and you learn about a way that you had no idea even existed, but you can pick up your journey pack today by scanning the QR code on the screen or going to tryfume.com/Brooke and using code Brooke for 10% off. Now let's get back to this story. So it was 1999 in Idaho, and 33-year-old Aletta Diane Ray, who went by Diane, lived in Twin Falls County with her 3-year-old daughter, Jade. She was also living with her boyfriend, Vern Jensen. Now, Diane was known to be an outgoing, a generous, a joyful woman who always put her daughter first. Her boyfriend, Vern, said that she was never impatient, even with those who were mean to her, such as her patients, and she always had a smile on her face. She was this kindest, sweetest woman he had ever met. Diane also had 5 children who didn't live with her at this time. The 3-year-old was the only one with her. But on September 9th of 1999, the police would be called to her residence, and they would find Diane slumped on the floor, DOA. Now, her lips were blue. During the search of the home, there was no signs of forced entry anywhere. There was also nothing missing, nothing out of place, as though there was some sort of struggle. And upon first glance, investigators believed that this was a natural death, except for the fact that her 3-year-old daughter had been there the entire time, and this child, who was practically a baby, had more to say.
Were you at home today with your mom?
Yes, and her is dead.
Really? I'm sorry.
Yes, but the big boy did it.
The big boy did it? What big boy?
The boy in it.
Was there one boy?
3 boys.
3 boys?
Mm-hmm. They rolled over the floor. And my mom told them about. Were them grown-ups or kids or what? Grown-ups. Grown-ups? Yes. I killed my mom.
3-year-old Jade, who had just witnessed a murder, forced police to take a second look, and Diane was sent in for an autopsy, and that is when the medical examiner would find methamphetamine as well as insulin in her system. This didn't automatically mean that they were looking at murder. These drugs were believed to cause an overdose, and her boyfriend Vern was questioned about if she was taking these drugs, and he was certain that she wasn't a user at all. That's when they believed that these drugs had been given to Diane, and this was in abundance through a syringe. This lethal injection was believed to be a homicide, and that is when an inquiry was launched. Now, Diane's boyfriend was questioned extensively, of course. He was more than willing to cooperate, and he was saying that morning he left for work at about 7 a.m., and he actually planned to pick up Jade and Diane around 11 a.m. However, he called home just to, check in with them, and Jade would be the one to answer the phone. And when Vern would ask her if he could talk to Mommy, she said that Mommy was asleep. And when Vern asked her to wake Diane up, she said that she couldn't and that Mommy had this blue-purple lipstick on. When Vern got home, Jade was watching TV, and again, she said that Mom was wearing blue-purple lipstick. So Vern went searching and found Diane in her bedroom, and she was on her stomach. And upon touching her, Vern realized she was cold. As it was found that this could most likely be murder, that is when Vern began talking about his estranged, soon-to-be ex-wife. Now, Vernon Jensen, who went by Vern, spoke about how he had met Diane, but he had married another woman, actually 2 women prior to Diane. And the first wife, fine marriage, they just divorced. The second wife he had met at work, and this was when he was about 20 years old. They had both been divorced once prior. This was Vicky, and she was a nurse, and Vern was a respiratory therapist, and they worked together, so they had quite a bit to talk about. They began going on dates, and that is when red flags began to show. Now, Vern would say that they hadn't officially become boyfriend and girlfriend yet. However, Vicky would call his mother's residence and demand to know where he was. Vern thought this was very strange and also didn't know how to bring this up to Vicky. He was very new at relationships. He didn't know much about how they worked. He was so young and he was quite naive. He was still not sure he wanted to even be with Vicky, and that is when Vern decided to take a job away from her that was in Twin Falls. However, when he told her about this, she said that she was going to move with him. So Vern, Vicky, and Vicky's son from a previous marriage all moved together, and in 1991 they officially got married. But this is when Vern began to have a closer relationship with Vicky's son, and Vern began to notice that this little boy had burns on his legs, and Vicky would tell him that it happened when she was giving him a bath and she had to step out of the room, and he had turned the water on way too hot and ended up burning himself. But when Vern was confused about how this actually happened and pressed her on this, that is when she began to get very angry. She claimed that she didn't hurt her son, but Vern knew something was wrong, and after the marriage was official between the two of them, he would see it firsthand, and Vicky would show her true character. She began yelling at him, hitting him. She would laugh in his face that he wouldn't hit her back. And instead of realizing that he was the victim here, this was abuse he was enduring, Vern began to blame himself, that he wasn't a good enough husband, and that the relationship problems were his fault. So he began trying harder to make it work. And meanwhile, he was having knives thrown at his head in the kitchen. And then Vicky began to talk about a plan for murder. This wasn't to murder Vern, though. It was to murder Vern's ex-wife. Now, Vern had 2 kids with his previous wife, and those 2 kids lived with his previous wife, and so he would pay child support. And around this time in 1997, that child support would end up going up in price because Vern had gotten a better paying job. And when Vicky learned about this, she began to hatch a plan to get rid of the ex-wife so they wouldn't have to pay the money. And when the words, "I'm going to kill that witch," came out of her mouth, Vern did not believe that she was serious. That is until she began to explain that she was going to inject her between the toes with insulin because no one would ever know. Vern would know this wasn't just talk when Vicky would show up at their home with those syringes, and Vern said this was the first time that he had ever told Vicky no, that he had ever stood up to her. She was telling him, "You need to go to your parents so you have an alibi," and Vern knew he had to do something to prevent this, so he grabbed the syringes and he drove away and threw them in a dumpster. Vern said at this point he didn't go to the police because he believed that they wouldn't do anything since it was just a threat and no crime had been committed, but that if she tried again, he would go to police. He was also scared of her, and when he told her that he would go to police next time she tried something like this, He said that this was a look of betrayal. After Vern stood up to Vicky, Vicky's abuse was said to escalate, and eventually he decided he had to get out. And so he began working with a divorce attorney. He moved out of their place. He was working even more to get more shifts, to get more money, and he was working solely really on himself. And that is when he began teaching a class at a nursing home, and one of the students there caught his eye. Now, these were adult students, and this was a woman who he seemed to have a very natural connection with. They could talk about anything. He felt as though they were kindred spirits and believed that she was a breath of fresh air. In fact, she was trying to get away from an abusive boyfriend herself, and so they were really talking each other through this. And this was Alita Diane Ray. For the first time in a long time, Vern felt hopeful. Together, they were healing. Together, they were separating from toxic relationships and coming together to create a healthy one. But Vicky was not going to let him go that easy. When she noticed that he had taken a whole bunch of his stuff and moved out of their house, she showed up at his work and demanded that he come home. Now, when Vern told her to leave him alone, that's when she began to say she didn't believe in divorce. She was not going through with this divorce. She allegedly told him divorce, never. Murder, maybe. Vern was so terrified that he went and bought a gun that night, and Vicky continued to stalk Vern. Vern was moving on without her, and she could not stand this. He cut off all communication. He wanted nothing to do with her, and in 1999, that July, he and Diane moved in together with Diane's daughter, Jade. This is when Vicky's anger turned towards the new woman in Vern's life, but Vern still thought that she was after him. Not only did this 39-year-old Vicky find out where they lived, but she began to show up at their door. She was threatening them. One time she even brought Diane's ex-boyfriend, who was that abusive man, and the boyfriend terrified Diane so incredibly much. They called the police at that point, and Vern told them that if anything happened to him, that they knew who did it, but there was nothing that they said that they could do at this point. Vicky began to threaten the entire family, and so Diane and Vern planned to completely move away to a different state to escape her, because the stalking was escalating. They could not go anywhere without seeing Vicky around the corner, and so Vern actually hatched a plan to send Diane away first. She was going to go about 200 miles away so that she felt safe. However, this plan did not come together fast enough. After 2 months of living together, on September 9th of 1999, Diane would be murdered. Vicky became the prime suspect at this time after talking to Vern, though there was no evidence that she was involved. Now, 3-year-old Jade knew that it was murder, and Vern knew it was done by his estranged wife. He even called her a psychopath when talking to investigators, yet it appeared as though there was nothing that they could do to arrest her and arrest this alleged killer. Vicky then called Vern after the murder, saying that she couldn't believe what happened to Diane and that she was sorry to hear it, and Vern ended up telling her that he knew she had killed her. Months would go by with no evidence being found that Vicky was involved in this murder. There were no arrests being made, and so this case was going cold. However, months later, a 14-year-old girl named Autumn Pauls, a high school student, was overheard telling her friends that she could take care of people without being caught. With this unsolved alleged murder happening in the town, investigators brought in this 14-year-old girl to talk. Now, Autumn quickly broke down and confessed. She implicated her 17-year-old boyfriend, Matthew Pearson, and her aunt, Vicky Jensen. Autumn told the police exactly what happened that day. She said that her aunt gave her money to go buy methamphetamine and also told Matthew to go buy a firearm. Then, Vicky bought disguises, and the night before the murder, they all spent the night together at Vicky's house and rehearsed what they were going to do. Autumn said that her boyfriend and her aunt and herself all drove to Diane's home, and they waited until Vern went to work around 7 a.m. They were then in disguise when they knocked on her door and asked if they could borrow her phone, and Diane, being this sweet woman, let them inside, and she was alone, and they knew that. Alone as in the only adult, however, her 3-year-old daughter was there. The three would ambush her. She suddenly had a gun pointed at her head. She was restrained, and Vicky injected her arm with what they now know was methamphetamine and insulin. At this time, they wanted to make it appear as though this was some sort of suicide or drug overdose. But Autumn said that Diane was pleading with them to stop, saying that she was allergic to methamphetamine. But Vicky allegedly said, "I don't care, B, you're going to die." The most horrific statement was made because they didn't just leave. They would stay there and watch Diane suffer for nearly an hour to make sure that she was dying and that she couldn't ask for help. When she wasn't dying fast enough, Vicky placed a pillow over her face. They then placed the methamphetamine in her purse to make it appear as though this belonged to her. All while 3-year-old Jade witnessed everything and then was left alone after these heartless killers fled. However, it was a miracle that Jade was still alive because Vicky was said to want to kill this 3-year-old that day as well, and Matthew talked her out of it. When Vicky was brought in for questioning after this confession, she sat in silence, and they told her that they knew everything. And that is when she spoke up and said she didn't know anything about it and wanted a lawyer. But Vicky Jensen would be arrested for first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit first-degree murder in February of 2000. They were seeking the death penalty, though Vicky would end up agreeing to a plea deal to dismiss the conspiracy charge as well as avoid the death penalty. But it was found at this point that while they watched Diane die for an hour, they could have saved her life. During the trial, Vicky's past was revealed prior to what Vern even knew about her. Vicky was raised in a seemingly very stable and supportive home. She was a good student. She graduated high school and then she went on to marry her high school sweetheart. They had a son together, but 3 years later they did end up divorcing. And that was the same year that Vicky graduated with an associate's degree in nursing and became a registered licensed nurse. Throughout the years, she worked at many different hospitals and care centers with all types of patients, and coworkers as well as patients seemed to love her. She was always very positive, caring, and dependable. However, it turned out that she had this act that she was putting on that nobody knew the other side of. Her neuropsychological exam would show that she didn't show great judgment or decision making, especially during highly charged emotional situations. She was more apt to make poor decisions. However, psychologists believed that she could have antisocial personality disorder, and this was denied with that test. Strangely enough, though, some of Vicky's family members would come to her defense claiming that she only committed the murder due to her devotion to her husband Vern, who was not yet her ex-husband, that she had converted to his religion and was so immersed in his beliefs that basically everything in her life centered around him. She was pushing everyone else away, and that when she wanted to have a child with him, wasn't able to, and then he left her, she stopped taking care of herself and was obsessed with getting him back. However, they were claiming that committing the murder was uncharacteristic of her. Though it was revealed by Vicky's parents that Vicky had another plan on how she was going to kill Diane prior to what she actually went through with. She had mentioned that she was going to kidnap Diane, take her to the desert, and beat her to death. Vicky had told her brother-in-law about this, who then told her parents, and when they spoke to her, she denied it. And after hearing that they knew her plan, she then came up with another one. Vern then testified that a few months after the murder, before Vicky was arrested, Vicky had showed up at his home and was asking if their marriage was officially over, and he told her it was. However, Vicky threatened him, saying that if she could not have him, nobody could. He said that at this point she looked different. There was nothing behind her eyes, and she went silent when Vern turned her down, which was the complete opposite to what she normally did in fighting, yelling, hitting back. Vern's new girlfriend at this time testified that Vicky began calling her and making threatening statements as well. It was found by the court that Vicky was unlikely to re-offend from this exam, Though, due to her crime and conduct after the murder, she was sentenced to life on March 14th of 2001. It disturbed many in the courtroom that Vicky used her medical knowledge to commit a coldly calculated murder, and Judge Roger Burdick said that Vicky was an evil mastermind. Vicky appealed this sentence, saying that no possibility of parole was excessive, but this was denied. She also went on to appeal the restitution payment of $22,500 to the State Fund for Financial Assistance for Victims of Crimes. She didn't want to pay to help support the daughter of the woman that she murdered. And this fund had paid for Diane's funeral. It was supposed to pay for, Jade and her life moving forward, but she didn't want to pay this. Matthew and Autumn, her accomplices, both did plead guilty. They took the same plea deal as Vicky, which meant that they were not going to get the death penalty. And since Autumn was only 15 at this point, she was sentenced to life with a minimum of 12 years. However, she was put on probation. Her sentence was suspended until her 21st birthday, when she would then serve the 12 years. Matthew was sentenced to 15 years to life, and they were both willing to pay the victims fund, unlike Vicky. But Vicky and Vern's divorce was finalized at this point as well. But when it came to Vern, he felt very guilty about Diane's death. He believed it was his fault. He began drinking heavily. He was so angry with Vicky that he wanted to strangle her, but he said that his faith saved him from letting his own anger destroy him. And he actually went on to film a documentary that was Evil Lives Here with Investigation Discovery, and he would actually speak to Vicky through the camera in case she ever saw this documentary, saying that he hopes she rots and is miserable where she is. But a now 24-year-old Jade recorded some questions for Vern to answer on this documentary, because the two hadn't spoken since all of this occurred. She wanted to know why he disappeared out of her life after all of this, and Vern explained that he did not want to be a reminder of what happened to her mother, but also that he just didn't know what to say to her. He admitted that her mother was gone because she loved him and he loved her. Jade then went on to ask Vern why he didn't stop this from happening if he knew that Vicky was violent, and he admitted that he didn't see the signs clear enough, and that if he knew, he would have moved heaven and earth to protect Diane. But in tears, he admitted he failed, and he hoped that Jade could forgive him. Now, because of this documentary, Jade and Vern have allegedly spoken, and now they are more in contact, and they consider each other family. But Jade has not spoken out very much at all. The one thing that I found online was that she has made her support for the Marcy Law very clear. And this was in 2018 when she wrote, "I was 3 years old when I witnessed this horrific tragedy. The murderers were eventually convicted, but when my mom's life ended, my life, at least as I knew it then, ended as well. I was only a toddler. I miss my mom every single day. I want to share this story to honor my mother, Alita Diane Ray, and the many others whose lives are cut short. They no longer have a voice. It's critical for victims to have a voice in the legal process, and this is one of the reasons why I support the Marcy's Law for Idaho. It gives victims who never wanted to be in the justice system a voice in the process of something that changed lives forever." And this was signed Jade Scotton, Twin Falls. Now, Marcy's Law for Idaho provides equal rights for crime victims, the same rights as the accused, nothing more, nothing less. This is a law we've spoken about before, and it makes all of the difference in the way that victims are respected and heard in the criminal justice system, and I highly recommend learning more about it, seeing if it has been passed in your state or how you can support it. Now, Vern did go on to remarry, and he said that his faith has helped him cope the most. He said that his love for Diane will always be there, and that he hopes people in similar situations have the courage to talk about it, to get away before it's too late. This case is an important reminder that domestic abuse can affect all genders. Males can be abused too, and they are less likely to speak out for fear of being misunderstood. They deserve a safe space to be heard too. As far as Jade, there's not much known about her life, but I hope that she is living the happiest, most peaceful life in honor of her mother. Without her, we may not have ever known that this was a murder. I hope she only remembers the good memories with her mother and is able to work through what she witnessed that day. She was too innocent to even know what blue lips meant. so sweet to believe that her mom was just trying on some blue lipstick. It does break my heart that her and Vern did not stay close, but grief and trauma does push people apart sometimes, and so I'm so thrilled that they have started talking again, and I hope that it does a lot for their healing process to have each other. A jealous woman who would not allow who she believed to be a possession of hers to find happiness with somebody else. And it really does make me wonder, with all of the medical knowledge she had, the fact that she was willing to use that knowledge to murder 2 different people. One just, she planned it, the other she committed it. It makes me wonder if there should be an investigation into her patients, into any suspicious deaths, sudden deaths, while she was working. Because this is something that is known to have happened with nurses, where they become these angels of death. I hope that that's not the case, but the fact that she was so willing to turn to murder at the first sign of trouble, it is concerning. I mean, Vern realized that his family was in danger to an extent, wanting to get Diane out of there to make her feel more safe, but it seems to me that he really truly believed that he was the person in most danger. Unfortunately, this love turned deadly and also traumatized a child. But don't forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces. Okay. Bye.